I was actually going to record a completely different video today. But there's been some huge news in Canadian passenger rail, and so I felt like I had to make this video to talk about it. In the span of a single day today, we have gotten more major news in Canadian passenger rail than we've seen in the last couple of years. And there's a lot happening with passenger rail in Canada, and so that's actually a pretty big statement. Obviously, passenger rail in most of North America right now is woefully inadequate. But with announcements like that, that's actually starting to shift, and that is incredibly exciting. The first big piece of news we got is that the Ontario Northlander train to Northern Ontario from Toronto is definitely coming back, and that is super exciting. Why can I say this? Well, because the Ontario government actually just ordered 3 Siemens Charger and Venture sets, the same ones that you'll see on Brightline and Via Rail, specifically for the Northlander, in a cool Northlander livery and all. These trains will be mini versions of what Via is getting, so 3 passenger cars and a charger each, but they look really great. And it actually sounds like Ontario Northland may be able to get into Via's order to get some economies of scale, which is great if true. Now apparently the trains will be used to provide 4 to 7 weekly trips from Toronto up to Northern Ontario, so up to a daily trip. It's not amazing, but a daily trip in peak times is pretty exciting, and to be fair, during off-peak times, which is winter time for the most part, a couple trains a week is still better than nothing, which is what we have today. Of course, if this is successful, there's no reason Ontario Northland couldn't order more trains in the future, and since they clearly have enough fleet to operate a daily service in the summer, they could probably push it to year-round, so I think things are pretty good overall. Now, the other really good thing about being integrated with the Via Rail order for those Siemens Chargers and Venture coaches is that they can probably take advantage of the upgraded Toronto maintenance facility that Via Rail is spending a bunch of money on to upgrade to maintain those Siemens sets. What that'll likely mean is better viability for Ontario Northland in the long term because their maintenance should get much cheaper because it will be standardized with most of the other passenger trains in Canada. Intercity passenger trains. Honestly though, it's just really exciting that this rail service is going from non-existent right now to existing with very nice modern trains in the span of a few years, and that has me really excited. The other big news in Canadian passenger rail today is that Via Rail's high-frequency rail project, which is kind of a husk of its former self, is actually moving forwards in a really interesting way. The government has announced that Via HFR will exist as a new subsidiary of Via Rail, and they're putting together a board of Canadian rail experts to staff the organization up. Now that being said, the organization will be looking for a private development partner for the HFR project, which is definitely going to have some mixed opinions. I certainly agree that having a state rail operator with experience in operating trains will drive a lower cost in the long term, and it's just generally going to be more popular. That being said, I'm not nearly as positive on the previous high-frequency rail plan as some folks. For one, the line wasn't planned to be all that fast, not even substantially faster than today's services. It was really meant for high frequency, which is an admirable goal, but if you're going to spend all the money on a new corridor, getting some higher speeds also makes sense, especially since the plan was to electrify like 90% of the corridor and potentially have some short sections operating with battery trains or something like that, which I don't love, especially in the Canadian climate where batteries just don't perform quite as well. The reality is that if you bring in a private partner for this service, you're going to be looking for more ridership than the original HFR plan was going to deliver. And what does that mean? Competing with flights. That is a huge deal. Flying in the corridor, particularly between Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal, is a huge portion of the flight emissions in Canada, particularly because short flights are more polluting than longer flights because takeoff is such a big part of the emissions. Now, as I said before, my personal preference is that Via probably contracts out the delivery of the project, but then holds the asset in the long term and probably operates it. But the reality is that today, Via is not equipped to build or operate a high-speed railway, certainly not to modern standards. And so at the very least, a realistic approach is to have a private partner, probably with some experience from a state railway in another country, to come in, teach Via how to operate a high-speed railway, and then do some sort of transition, which is sort of what will probably happen, even if over a longer term than we'd like. Now, people have been asking me why am I saying it's a high-speed railway, and that's because some information that was in La Presse recently mentioned that the Canadian Transportation Minister kind of openly said to the private development partners, give us a solution that will allow for up to 300 kilometers per hour, which is the kind of world-class standard for new high-speed rail lines. The plans for Rail HFR weren't fully electrified and also didn't even have it fully reaching 200 kilometers per hour, which no trains in Canada currently do. I also think it is worth pointing out that there is less institutional value in creating an agency capable of building high-speed rail corridors in Canada, where there's at most 2 corridors where high-speed rail really makes sense. Ultimately, I just don't see why in 2022, with all of the progress Canada has made on urban rail transit along the corridor in Kitchener-Waterloo, Toronto, Montreal, Ottawa, Quebec City, Hamilton, potentially other places, why we would essentially build a greenfield, not entirely electrified railway connecting these places. It wouldn't be competitive with flying, and it wouldn't make it easy to eventually remove flights from the corridor, which I see as a critical thing to us reducing our GHG emissions and actually achieving some of our climate targets. With true high-speed rail, there is definitely a case to be made that we could ban flights between Toronto and Montreal, and that would be huge. There's also a bit of a strategic political argument for a private partner and some private dollars being involved in the project, in that if the government changes, which, let's be honest, there's a decent chance of it sounds like, the project is much more likely to go ahead and much more difficult to kill if that's a part of the equation. And honestly, since that's one of my main concerns here, that we could get close to a new project but that it would get cancelled, I actually see a single package project where a private consortium delivers the full high-speed rail corridor and contracts are signed, potentially before the end of this political term, which is when the RFPs are meant to close, would be great for actually securing the project as something that's going to happen whether government switches or not. It just feels like an actual shot at getting full high-speed rail, and it's something that I think if we don't pursue, we're going to regret 15, 20 years down the line. I sort of imagine the eventual operating pattern will be something like what you see in the US Northeast Corridor, albeit with 2 different corridors instead of a single one. With one corridor operating high-speed trains, that's the new HFR, but also HSR corridor, and then the traditional lakeshore route, which is still incredibly valuable and needs a lot of service. Kingston is like the busiest station outside of Toronto and Montreal, still gets a high-quality service with more frequent trains, better sets from Siemens, but also maybe potentially eventually electrification as well. Altogether, if this project actually ends up getting done, we'll have done an incredible amount for passenger rail in Canada in the last 30 years. From the creation of the REM and Go RER, both the suburban network and the longer distance regional network to places like London and Niagara Falls and Barrie. Also the O train in Ottawa, and as I mentioned, Kitchener-Waterloo and Hamilton and potentially Quebec City. It will be a complete sea change for the country. Oh, and full 300 km per hour world-beating high-speed rail. It will just be a complete sea change for the country, and it really excites me.